To that address that that many of our viewers would have seen this afternoon. Paul Keating back at the press club, some vintage turn of phrase delivered there today. An argument that he's held for some time. It won't sit well with many, I think, on both sides of the political divide, Andrew.
Well, yes, he lashed both major policies on their China policy, their foreign policy. A senior federal government source saying it was an impressive performance to me, but it wasn't strategy, it was madness a short time ago. I guess wanting to get their two bobs worth in before I was on air. Anyway, Paul Keating at the National Press Club for the first time since he was the PM in the 1990s, at age 77 today, a year younger than Joe Biden, and the former PM coming off the bipartisan Australian view on China and the US view on China, arguing there is no way to avoid dealing with the country and denying China is about overturning the world order or about conquering other nations. Big powers are rude, says Keating, but in remarks many will disagree with, says China is not a contiguous threat to Australia and it will become a more civilised society.
The Chinese are in their rude phase, you know, they're in the adolescent phase of their diplomacy. They've got testosterone running everywhere. You know, but we have to deal with them because their power will be so profoundly big in this part of the world. China does not represent a contiguous threat to Australia. I mean, I think, look, the key point is this, I think, is that China is not about turning over the existing world order. It only wants to reform it. It's the proselytiser of globalisation in the world. It's not pursuing, this is not the old Soviet Union pursuing some international ideology, some, whether universal or otherwise. It wants to be in the existing order, has signed up the existing order, but wants it reformed so it's fair.
Former Prime Minister saying here Taiwan is not central to our interests if invaded.
Taiwan is not a vital Australian interest. Let me repeat that. Taiwan is not a vital Australian interest, you know. We have no alliance with Taipei, none. There's no document you can find. We do not recognise it as a sovereign state, right? And under ANZUS commits us to consult in the event of an attack on US forces, but not an attack by US forces, right? We are committed to ANZUS for an attack on US forces, but we are not committed under ANZUS to an attack by US forces, which means Australia should not be drawn, in my view, into a military engagement over Taiwan, US-sponsored or otherwise.
He was critical of Prime Minister Scott Morrison's decision to use the G7+ forum at Cornwall in June to head back to the UK and US on foreign policy and take on China, which is in the region.
We're not happy to be in the region. We're still trying to find our security from Asia rather than in Asia. So here we had the Prime Minister going back to Cornwall, where James Cook had left 245 years earlier, and where Arthur Phillip and the First Fleet had left 233 years earlier. Here we are back there to find our security from Asia. But instead of that, we've now got this sort of fiction, you know, the thing called the Indo-Pacific, like a big rectangular box, you know, and on one end of the box is India, and the other end of the box is Japan. But in other words, but we're not focusing on the middle of the box, which is Indonesia and ASEAN. We're on either end. It's like a seesaw at the park. I've taken the view always that engagement with China and its absorption of the region will establish a better framework for both China and the United States to work in, including Australia. And China's simply too big and too central to be ostracised.
Keating saying what the authoritarian regime in China and our biggest export partner wants is respect.
At least give it respect. I mean, you know, having Maurice Payne on Insiders, which is a sort of peekaboo, you know, show for insomniacs, you know, tell without it, I understand a cabinet decision, no, we're going to put inspectors into Wuhan about the virus.
Now, I should point out in the wake of that G7 Plus meeting, both Boris Johnson and Scott Morrison told me they didn't want to see a Cold War or a war with China. What offends you most about China's behaviour? And can you see the difficulties Australia has with dealing with this in terms of the fact 40% of our exports go to China?
And nobody wants to descend into a new Cold War with China. We don't see that as the way forward. This is a difficult relationship where it is vital to engage with China.
Australians fear war with China. You hear that anecdotally. What would you say to reassure them about that?
Oh well, that is not an outcome that we would wish for in any circumstance. I mean, that is why you take the steps that we do take to ensure that you can get some stability in the region.
Now, the Australian ambassador to the US, Arthur Sinodinos, in a talk in Washington today, said that he and the Australian government are working on truncating Scott Morrison's AUKUS timeline of 18 months for a task force to come up with a plan for building nuclear submarines with US and UK technology. It had previously been mooted that this task force could report back within 12 months as opposed to the original 18-month timeline. That would still obviously be post-election, the announcement having been made around AUKUS in September.
We've got 12 to 18 months and we're hoping to do it as quickly as possible, not have to use the full 18 months. We've got people coming into the embassy to help with this work here in Washington. The White House, the Pentagon is staffing up as well. And the UK is doing the same thing. So watch this space.
Paul Keating says these subs will be 50 years old and out of date once we get them.
These Virginia-class submarines were designed in the 1990s. By the time we have half a dozen of them, it'll be 2045 or 50. They'll be 50 or 60 years old. In other words, our new submarines will be old tech. It'd be like buying an old 747, you know. And here we are, we're going to wait, 20 odd years to get the first one, and 35 or 40 years to get the lot, for these what will be then very old boats.
Politically, it will be interesting to see Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong's reaction to these comments. Scott Morrison will be welcoming them. I think if Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong were to agree with Paul Keating here, they'd probably lose the election. Here's Keating having a swing at both parties.
Both the parties have lost their way in respect of Australian foreign policy. Labor gets a briefing one night, and by 11 o'clock the next morning, they're in the cart, They've taken a position, certainly Penny Wong's taken a position, there shouldn't be an ounce of daylight between her and the Liberal Party, that is Julia Bishop and Maurice Payne. Now, that way you end up with a reasonably quiet political life. You have no big disputes because you're glued up onto the government. I'm here to say that the parties, in respect of their current policies, are fundamentally not up to it, both of them. That is the Coalition and the Labor Party.
Former Prime Minister Keating there. Now, don't forget, next week Sky News presents a landmark two-part documentary exploring the power of China. China Rising is next Tuesday, November 16 and Wednesday, November 17, 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. My colleague Pete Stefanovic presents the unmissable special investigation. Make sure you join Pete.